The Prime Directive is Star Trek's holiest law. At least, that's what it eventually became. By the time of The Next Generation, Jean-Luc Picard spoke of the Prime Directive with the reverence of Scripture. In the episode Symbiosis, he outright declares that the Prime Directive is not just a set of rules, it's a philosophy, and a very correct one. To Picard, the directive wasn't just law, it was morality itself. In TNG, violating it wasn't a command decision, it was sacrilege. But it never started that way. In the original series, the Prime Directive was something entirely different. It wasn't a religion, it wasn't even untouchable. It was a regulation. Harsh, dangerous to disobey, but disobeyable if the situation demanded it. Breaking it was like disobeying a direct order in the military. It was perilous. Get it right and you're a hero. Get it wrong and you'll never wear the uniform again. That balance, that ability to defy the rule at great risk, gave Kirk's Starfleet its texture. It made the Prime Directive a constant source of tension, a line officers had to wrestle with instead of simply worship. But with Picard, the tension vanished. The directive stopped being a regulation and became a religion. It spread across the franchise, infecting Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and even Enterprise. And the ultimate irony is this. Gene Roddenberry, a staunch atheist who rejected organized religion, gave us Star Trek's first scripture. So if we want to talk about who destroyed the Prime Directive, it wasn't Discovery, or Strange New Worlds, or even the messy moral compromises of modern Trek. It was Jean-Luc Picard, when he turned a military regulation into dogma. To understand how deeply things changed, we need to go back to the original series, when the Prime Directive was first introduced. And what we see there is not dogma, but duty. In Kirk's era, the directive functioned like a military order, strict, absolute on paper, but subject to the judgment of a commanding officer. You could break it, but if you did, you'd better be right. Because if you weren't just making a bad call. You were finished. It was just as perilous as disobeying a direct order in the military. You could perhaps even be considered a traitor if you did. Let's look at some examples. In A Private Little War, Kirk faces a planet where Klingon agents are arming one faction of a primitive society. The directive forbids him from interfering. Yet Kirk recognizes that if he does nothing, the Klingons will dominate the world. His solution? Arm the other side to restore balance. He admits, I must violate the Prime Directive or let a planet fall to the Klingons. In The Apple, Kirk destroys Vol, a computer deity that holds an entire society in a state of stagnation. By any measure, this is a direct violation of the directive. But Kirk justifies it because Vol's control prevents progress. His choice is a calculated gamble. Defy the rule, risk punishment, but believe history will vindicate him. In Return of the Archons, Kirk dismantles Landu's system of enforced harmony. It looks peaceful, but it's a false peace maintained by authoritarian control. Kirk decides freeing people from oppression is worth more than obeying orders. And in A Taste of Armageddon, Kirk destroys the computer systems of two planets that fight wars through simulation. His choice is shocking. He obliterates their system of control, forcing them into actual combat unless they pursue peace. And these aren't all of the examples. I could go on and on. One theme repeats. The Prime Directive in the original series is serious, but not sacred. It is a captain's burden. The line that officers must constantly weigh, knowing that disobedience could end their careers, but inaction could condemn entire worlds. That tension, the possibility of disobedience with consequences, is what gave the Prime Directive its dramatic power. Kirk wasn't a priest of a moral code. He was a soldier making impossible choices. And that's the key difference. Because when we move into the Picard era, the directive stops being a perilous regulation and becomes something else entirely. It becomes untouchable. It becomes philosophy. It becomes, in practice, a kind of religion. If the original series treated the Prime Directive as a perilous regulation, then the next generation elevated it into scripture. And no one embodied that change more than Jean-Luc Picard. Picard didn't just follow the Prime Directive, he preached it. He spoke of it not as a regulation, but as a philosophy, and one that was morally unimpeachable. In Symbiosis, he says plainly, the Prime Directive is not just a set of rules. It is a philosophy, and a very correct one. That's not the voice of a commander weighing orders. That's the voice of a man speaking doctrine. And here's the critical point. Picard wasn't just any captain. He commanded the Enterprise, the flagship of the Federation. His interpretation of the Prime Directive wasn't confined to his bridge crew. It carried the weight of policy. It influenced other captains, Starfleet Academy curriculum, and even Federation Council debates. What Picard said, and did, was broadcast as the example of what Starfleet should be. Which means, when he treated the Prime Directive like Holy Writ, the entire Federation learned to do the same. In the episode Justice, Wesley Crusher accidentally breaks a local law and is sentenced to death. The Edo Society enforces absolute justice. One law, one punishment. Picard faces a decision. Violate the Prime Directive to save a child, or let Wesley die to uphold the law of another culture. Kirk, in this situation, would have found a loophole. He would have argued the directive didn't apply, or simply broken it and dealt with the consequences. But Picard agonizes. He nearly sacrifices Wesley, again, a child, to preserve the directive's purity. There can be no justice so long as laws are absolute, he says, but then treats the Prime Directive as if it's an absolute. The contradiction is glaring. He sees the danger of rigid law, yet cannot bring himself to violate Starfleet's most rigid one. This is the Prime Directive not as guideline, but as sacrament. In Pen Pals, Data communicates with a young girl on a planet suffering ecological collapse. She begs for help. The crew debates. Do they intervene and save her world, or let the directive stand? Picard, never one to walk away from watching children burn, declares, the Prime Directive is not just a set of rules. It's a philosophy, and a very correct one. His position is clear. Better to let a planet die, with children on it, than to risk violating the doctrine. The directive is treated as a moral absolute that supersedes compassion, survival, even common sense. Where Kirk would have said, if the law forbids saving lives, then the law is wrong, Picard says, if the law forbids saving lives, then saving lives is wrong. That is the language of religion. And who watches the Watchers? A Federation outpost accidentally exposes a pre-warp culture, leading the Mintakans to believe Picard is a god. What follows is surreal. Picard becomes a literal high priest of the Prime Directive here. He gathers the Mintakans, explains that he is not a deity, and pleads with them to understand the principle of non-interference. He isn't just following the law, he's evangelizing it. Kirk once imposed his own morality on alien societies. Picard imposes the morality of non-interference. Both are interventions, but Picard's intervention is paradoxically to spread his religion of not intervening. Now I can already hear the typing for the actually comments. Yes, Picard does occasionally break the Prime Directive, But that actually proves the point. Kirk broke the directive constantly and shrugged it off as the price of command. Picard, even when he violated it, treated it like a mortal sin. He agonized over the decision, justified it at length, or framed it as a tragic necessity. Kirk broke orders like a soldier defying command. Picard broke doctrine like a priest confessing. His hypocrisy wasn't a rejection of the directive's sacredness. It was proof of how sacred he considered it. And when the man at the head of the flagship treats the Prime Directive as holy, even while breaking it, the lesson that spreads across Starfleet isn't, sometimes you must bend the rules. The lesson is, this rule is sacred, and breaking it is a stain. As captain of the flagship, Picard's speeches weren't just personal philosophy. They became the Federation's doctrine. Officers who served with him spread his interpretation throughout the fleet. Cadets at Starfleet Academy studied his decisions as precedent. The Federation Council looked to him as the moral conscience of Starfleet. In effect, Picard institutionalized the Prime Directive as religion. Where Kirk's bold defiance made it a living, flexible order, Picard's reverence calcified it. And that's the irony. Gene Roddenberry, an outspoken atheist who rejected organized religion, as I've stated, ended up creating one in his own fictional universe. Under Picard, the Federation didn't just have laws, it had a faith system, a central doctrine that guided morality and defined right from wrong. To violate the Prime Directive was no longer to risk career consequences, it was to commit heresy. Picard, by virtue of his command and his reference, became the man who turned the Federation into a theocracy. The Prime Directive had become Starfleet's creed, but here's the irony. It was never meant to be that way. I've stated a couple of times by now the atheism of Gene Roddenberry. He distrusted doctrine and imagined a future where humanity had moved beyond dogma. And yet, through his creation, he gave us one of fiction's most enduring faiths. Because under Picard, the Prime Directive stopped being a regulation and became a religion. Not just in the Federation, but in our world too. Fans revere it as sacred. They quote Picard's words as if they're gospel. Roddenberry didn't design it as scripture. He intended it as a source of conflict, a rule captains would wrestle with, bend, and sometimes break. But thanks to Picard's interpretation, through the flagship, through TNG's cultural reach, the Prime Directive, when talking about Trek, became sanctified. And through that sanctification, Roddenberry the atheist created adherence in the real world. That's why even today, when you argue that Picard turned the directive into dogma, some fans get angry, some will unsubscribe, some will insist you don't understand Trek or haven't watched it, because for them the Prime Directive has become more than a story device. It's a core belief in Trek. And to enjoy Trek, you have to believe in its core beliefs. And in that sense, Picard's influence reached farther than the Federation. He didn't just turn the Federation into a theocracy. He turned part of the fan base into one as well. Once Picard elevated the Prime Directive into doctrine, its influence didn't stay confined to the Enterprise. It spread across Starfleet, across the Federation, and even Star Trek itself. On Deep Space Nine, Benjamin Sisko is a pragmatic commander who bends rules when the situation demands it. But even here, the Prime Directive lingers in the background, like scripture. On Voyager, Janeway preaches the directive but applies it inconsistently, clinging to doctrine in one episode, bending it in the next. She's the believer who can't quite live up to the faith. On Enterprise, Set before the directive was even written, Archer struggles with non-interference dilemmas that foreshadow its creation as though it were destiny, prophecy instead of policy. Fans of Picard's era often defend those moments in DS9, Voyager, and Enterprise with the same fervor. The directive has become part of Trek's identity. To challenge it, to suggest it was never meant as scripture, is to simply invite argument. Because for many fans, the Prime Directive isn't just a story device. It's the moral core of Star Trek. And when you tell them it wasn't designed that way, they react like believers told their scripture was meant to be questioned. The irony is striking. We look at a universe where his characters and his fans cling to a secular religion. Picard preached it, Starfleet institutionalized it, and the fandom absorbed it. So by the time Voyager and Enterprise rolled around, the Prime Directive wasn't just Federation law, something required by Starfleet. It was a Federation faith, and like all faiths, it produced contradictions, hypocrisies, and endless debates over how to interpret its words. As I've discussed, by the time of The Next Generation, the Prime Directive had hardened into scripture. In TNG, DS9, Voyager, and even Enterprise, this legacy was carried, reinforcing the directive as untouchable law, even when it bent the logic of the story. But here's where things get weird. Because modern Trek, for all of its failures, has begun to break the spell. In the premiere of Strange New Worlds, Pike confronts a pre-warp society on the brink of all-out nuclear war. By the letter of the Prime Directive, he should stand aside. But he doesn't. He violates it openly, and Starfleet shields him from punishment. It's presented as necessary. In Among the Lotus Eaters, Pike again skirts the directive, restoring a society destabilized by outside contamination. The nuance is important. The Prime Directive isn't gone, but it's back to being a law applied with conscience, not worship. Discovery treats it flexibly as well. Burnham and Pike both bend it when survival is on the line. Violations are framed as pragmatic choices, not mortal sins. In loosening the dogma, modern Trek didn't elevate the conversation. It simplified it. The Federation is no longer a theocracy of non-interference, but the trade-off is that Starfleet's most defining moral conflict has been watered down. The Prime Directive still exists. Captains still invoke it, but in the hands of modern Trek, it no longer functions as a religion. It is once again what it was in the original series, a perilous regulation, breakable when necessity demands it. The difference is that Legacy Trek used that tension to spark timeless moral questions. Modern Trek, by tying its stories directly to today's politics and culture, risks it feeling like a downgrade. It isn't that the Prime Directive has lost its power. It's that the way it's written no longer challenges us the way it once did. The Prime Directive has always been Star Trek's most famous law, but what it represented has shifted across eras. In Kirk's time, it was a perilous regulation, absolute on paper, but breakable when conscience demanded it. Get it right, you were a hero. Get it wrong, you'd never wear the uniform again. Under Picard, it became something else entirely. Not law, but doctrine. Not regulation, but religion. He was the high priest of non-interference, and by commanding the Federation flagship, he turned his personal reverence into Federation-wide dogma. What began as a captain's burden calcified into the Federation's creed. That creed spread across DS9, Voyager, and Enterprise, shaping Starfleet culture and the fanbase itself. The irony is undeniable. This was all created by Gene Roddenberry. He wanted a future free of gods, but ended up creating a scripture, both for the Federation and for us. Is it any surprise that he also created Q. And yet, modern Trek has begun to pull away from the dogma. Captains like Pike and Burnham treat the Prime Directive as law again. Serious, yes, but not untouchable. In their hands, it has returned to being a tool, not a faith. So, in the end, who destroyed the Prime Directive? It wasn't Discovery or Strange New Worlds, or the often messy choices of modern Trek. It was Jean-Luc Picard. By elevating